I'd like to call the Bremen High School District 228 Board of Education Special Meeting to order. If I can have the roll call, please.
Mr. Canning?
Here.
Mrs. Gleason?
Here.
Mr. Johnson?
Here.
Mrs. Jones?
Here.
Mrs. Camper here. Mrs. Ressler? Here. Ms. Stearns?
Here. Please rise for the pledge. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Is there any comment from the public? At this time, I'd like a motion to move to closed session to consider information regarding the appointment, employment, compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of a specific employee.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Johnson, second by Mrs. Gleason. Any discussion? No discussion. Roll call.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Gleason?
Aye.
Mr. Canning?
Aye.
Mrs. Jones?
Aye.
Mrs. Camper? Aye. Mrs. Ressler? Aye. Ms. Stearns?
Aye. I'd like a motion to return to open session.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Ressler, second by Mrs. Gleason.
Mrs. Ressler? Aye. Mrs. Gleason?
Aye.
Mr. Canning?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. Jones?
Aye.
Mrs. Camper? Aye. Ms. Stearns?
Aye. We have some motions as a result of our closed session. Mrs. Gleason, if you read yours, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Stearns. Pursuant to the request of Dr. Simone, I move to continue the hearing on the recommendation to terminate Dr. Simone until a date to be set by the superintendent.
So moved.
Second.
Mrs. Gleason moved, Mr. Johnson second. Any discussion? No discussion. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Gleason?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Canning?
Aye.
Mrs. Jones?
Aye.
Mrs. Camworth, aye. Mrs. Ressler? Aye. Ms. Stearns?
Aye. Mrs. Ressler, if you please read your motion.
I move to suspend Dr. Simone without pay for up to 30 employment days pursuant to the Board Policy 5-2.40 for misconduct that is detrimental to the school district, including being subject to a bail bond conditioned upon his having no contact with minors other than his own children and no contact with a particular student, being unable to perform his job duties and other sufficient causes.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Ressler, second by Mr. Johnson. Any discussion? No discussion. Mr. Johnson.
Roll call.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Mrs. Ressler? Aye. Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Canning?
Aye.
Mrs. Gleason?
Aye.
Mrs. Jones?
Aye.
Mrs. Camworth, aye. Ms. Stearns?
Aye. Mr. Johnson.
All right. I move to deny Dr. Simone a request for discovery.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Johnson, second by Mrs. Gleason. Any discussion? No discussion. Roll call, please.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mrs. Gleason?
Aye.
Mr. Canning?
Aye.
Mrs. Jones?
Aye.
Mrs. Camworth, aye. Mrs. Ressler? Aye. Ms. Stearns?
Aye. Our announcements are as follows. Personnel will meet Tuesday, February 9th at 5:30 at the Ed Center, followed by Teaching and Learning at 6:30. Finance will meet Wednesday, February 10th, 7 p.m. at the Ed Center. The next Board of Education meeting is Tuesday, February 16th, 7 p.m. at Tinley Park High School. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
So second.
This is the finance meeting at 6 o'clock, Christine?
It is at 6 o'clock.
Finance at 6 o'clock. I'm sorry, who made the motion?
To adjourn?
Mrs. Gleason, second by Ms. Campbell. All in favor, aye?
Aye.